Power has a price, and history is littered with the receipts. We are about to journey back in time to uncover 25 of the most controversial decisions ever made by ancient leaders, choices that shattered empires, erased cultures, and rewrote the very map of human civilization. By the end of this, you will understand the thin line between visionary genius and catastrophic folly. We will see a Roman emperor declare war on the ocean itself, and a pharaoh who tried to erase 1,000 gods. Which choice sealed a philosopher's fate, and what drove a queen to burn her own world to the ground? When you think of absolute power, what is the first risk that comes to your mind? Our story starts with a man who wanted to be a god. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, had achieved the impossible. He forged 7 warring kingdoms into a single, sprawling empire. But holding that empire together required more than just armies and walls. It demanded a single, unified mind. In 213 BCE, he issued a decree that would echo through the centuries, a decision so brutal it remains a symbol of intellectual tyranny. He ordered the burning of books and the burying of scholars. This was not a random act of destruction. It was a calculated, systematic purge. The emperor targeted specific schools of thought, primarily Confucianism, which preached virtues like benevolence and respect for the past. These ideas were dangerous to a ruler building a new world based on strict legalist principles, where the law was absolute and the emperor's word was final. So the command went out. Historical records, poetry, and philosophical texts from all other states were to be gathered and set ablaze. The goal was to erase the memory of any other way of life, any other source of authority. Imagine the smoke rising from those pyres, carrying the accumulated wisdom of generations into nothingness. But the emperor did not stop with the written word. He went after the living libraries themselves, the scholars. The historical accounts are chilling. Some say he had hundreds of them buried alive. Others tell of them being forced into hard labor until they died. The message was unmistakable. To question the new order, to even remember the old one, was a death sentence. The immediate cultural loss was catastrophic. Countless unique works, histories, and ideas were lost forever, creating a permanent gap in our understanding of ancient Chinese thought. The long-term impact, however, is a complex and haunting paradox. On one hand, Qin Shi Huang succeeded in standardizing Chinese culture for centuries. He unified the written script, the currency, and the measurements, creating a foundation for a continuous Chinese state. Yet, his attempt to control thought ultimately backfired. The very Confucian ideals he tried to erase were resurrected and became the official state ideology of the next great dynasty, the Han, and would dominate Chinese society for the next 2,000 years. His brutal suppression became a cautionary tale, a dark lesson in the futility of trying to kill an idea. He sought to be the final author of history, but his most enduring legacy is the empty space on the shelf where other voices once spoke. While the ashes of China's books were still settling, another emperor would face a different kind of blaze, one that would forge his reputation in infamy. In the sweltering summer of 64 AD, a fire broke out in the shops around Rome's Circus Maximus. Fanned by strong winds, it raged for 6 devastating days, consuming 3 of the city's 14 districts entirely and leaving only 4 untouched. Hundreds died and thousands were left homeless, and at the center of this catastrophe stood the young Emperor Nero. The story we have inherited is damning. It is said that while his city burned, Nero ascended to his private stage, and with the flames as his backdrop, sang a song about the fall of Troy, accompanying himself on the lyre. The phrase "Nero fiddled while Rome burned" was born, a permanent shorthand for a leader's callous indifference. But how much of this is true? The accounts we have come from historians who wrote decades after the event, men who despised him. There is no contemporary evidence that he played music during the fire itself. In fact, some records suggest he was not even in Rome when it started, but rushed back to organize a relief effort. He opened his own gardens to the homeless and arranged for food supplies to be brought in. So why did the story of the fiddling emperor stick? Because it fit a narrative Nero had already written for himself. He was a performer, an artist who craved the stage in a culture that believed its leaders should be soldiers and statesmen. His public performances were seen as scandalous and undignified. When the people of Rome, reeling from their loss, needed someone to blame, their unconventional emperor was an easy target. The rumors of his musical indifference were the perfect symbol of a ruler disconnected from his people's suffering. But Nero needed a scapegoat of his own, to divert the growing suspicion that he himself had started the fire to clear land for a lavish new palace. He pointed a finger at a small, secretive, and widely misunderstood sect. The Christians. He unleashed a wave of horrific persecutions. Followers of this new faith were arrested, tortured, and executed in brutal public spectacles. Some were crucified, others were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Perhaps most chillingly, many were covered in tar, impaled on stakes, and set alight to serve as human torches for the emperor's garden parties. This was more than just punishment. It was a calculated act of political theater designed to placate a populace by feeding them a visible enemy. The immediate political fallout was severe. The persecution failed to salvage his reputation. Instead, it cemented his legacy as a tyrant, both among the Roman elite and the growing Christian community, whose writings would forever paint him as a monster. The Great Fire and his response to it became the turning point, eroding the last vestiges of support for his rule and setting him on a path that would end just 4 years later in a declared public enemy fleeing Rome and taking his own life. His story is a masterclass in how a leader's response to a crisis, whether filled with action or perceived apathy, can become the single event that defines them for all time. There is a river in northern Italy, a shallow, unassuming stream called the Rubicon. To cross it with an army was an act of high treason under Roman law, a final, irrevocable step that no general was permitted to take. On a cold January day in 49 BC, a single man stood on its banks, weighing a choice that would shatter a 500-year-old republic. That man was Julius Caesar. He had just completed a brilliant 9-year campaign to conquer Gaul, and in doing so had built a battle-hardened army fiercely loyal to him personally. But back in Rome, his political enemies, led by the staunch traditionalist Cotto and his former ally Pompey, were moving to destroy him. They demanded he disband his legions and return to the city as a private citizen, where he would face almost certain exile or worse, prosecution and political ruin. Caesar was cornered. To obey the Senate meant the end of his power, his fortune, and likely his life. To defy them meant civil war. The moment of decision arrived. He plunged into the river, leading the 13th Legion across the boundary and into the heartland of Rome itself. As he crossed, he is said to have muttered a phrase that has become a proverb for passing a point of no return. The die is cast. With those words, he was not merely moving troops. He was declaring war on his own state, shattering the very principle that had kept the Republic safe from military dictators for centuries. The principle that no soldier should ever owe his primary allegiance to a general over the Senate and the people of Rome. The immediate effect was panic. Pompey and much of the Senate fled Rome in disarray, unprepared for the speed and audacity of Caesar's move. What followed was a brutal 4-year civil war that ripped the Mediterranean world apart, pitting Roman against Roman in a struggle for the soul of their state. Caesar's gamble paid off in the short term. He emerged victorious, becoming the undisputed master of Rome. He was appointed dictator for life, a title that rang with the death knell of the old republican system. He began a sweeping series of reforms, from revising the calendar to settling his veterans, but the old guard saw only a tyrant. His crossing of the Rubicon had normalized the unthinkable. It made the army the ultimate arbiter of political power. The long-term consequences were even more profound. While Caesar himself would famously fall to assassins' daggers just 5 years later, the republic he broke could not be put back together. The precedent was set. His adopted heir, Octavian, learned from his father's fate and, after winning his own civil wars, created the system we know as the Roman Empire, cloaking absolute power in the faded robes of republican titles. The crossing of that one small river did not just start a war. It redirected the entire course of Western history, proving that sometimes the most dangerous borders are not those that separate nations, but the lines a leader chooses to cross. The shadow of Caesar's ambition fell across the Mediterranean, but the next great gamble for the Roman world would be made not in its forum, but in the court of an Egyptian queen. Cleopatra VII was no mere pawn in the power struggles of Rome. She was a brilliant strategist fighting for the survival of her kingdom, the last pharaoh of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Her decision to form a deep alliance with the Roman general Mark Antony was a masterstroke of political and personal calculus. After the assassination of Julius Caesar, Rome was divided between 3 men, the Second Triumvirate. Antony, ruling the wealthy eastern provinces, was the most powerful of them all. Cleopatra saw in him not just a protector, but a partner who could help her restore Egypt to its former glory and secure her throne against her rivals. Their partnership began as a political necessity, a merging of her vast wealth and resources with his military might. But it very quickly blossomed into something far more personal and profound, a legendary romance that would shape the destiny of 2 civilizations. Together, they envisioned a new Hellenistic empire, a grand fusion of Roman power and Eastern culture, with their children destined to rule a world reshaped in their image. This vision, however, placed them on a direct collision course with the 3rd member of the triumvirate, Octavian, Caesar's cold and calculating adopted son. Octavian masterfully spun their alliance as a betrayal of Rome itself. He portrayed Cleopatra as a seductive foreign sorceress who had ensnared a noble Roman, and Antony as a man so corrupted by Eastern decadence that he had forsaken his duty. The propaganda war was fierce, and Octavian was winning. He read out Antony's will to the Roman Senate, a document that allegedly left Roman territories to his children with Cleopatra and requested to be buried beside her in Alexandria. For the Roman elite, this was the ultimate proof of treason. The Senate stripped Antony of his powers and declared war not on him but on Cleopatra. The final confrontation came at the sea battle of Actium in 31 BC. The 2 massive fleets clashed in a struggle for the future of the Western world. Yet at the height of the battle, a moment of inexplicable panic unfolded. Cleopatra's squadron of 60 ships suddenly broke from the combat line and sailed for the open sea. Antony, seeing her flee, abandoned his own commanding position and followed. His flagship chased after hers, leaving the bulk of his fleet and army to be captured or destroyed by Octavian's forces. Why did they run? Was it a prearranged escape plan after a battle already lost, or a catastrophic failure of nerve? The reason remains one of history's great mysteries. The immediate aftermath was ruin. Their military power was shattered beyond repair. Within a year, Octavian's forces invaded Egypt, facing certain capture and the humiliation of being paraded through the streets of Rome as a trophy. Both Antony and Cleopatra chose to take their own lives. The long-term consequences were absolute. Egypt, the last great Hellenistic kingdom, was absorbed into the Roman Empire, its vast grain reserves and treasure now fueling Octavian's new regime. He returned to Rome as its first true emperor, soon to be given the title Augustus. Cleopatra's gamble had failed, but it was a failure that birthed the Roman Empire and closed the final chapter of the Republic. Her decision to back Mark Antony was a desperate play for independence in a world that was rapidly consolidating under a single, unchallenged power. Athens, the birthplace of democracy, held a trial that would become its most enduring shame. In the year 399 BC, a jury of 501 Athenian citizens found the 70-year-old philosopher Socrates guilty. His crimes were not murder or theft, but ideas. He was charged with impiety for not believing in the city's official gods, and with corrupting the youth of Athens by teaching them to question everything. This was not a straightforward case of religious persecution. It was a city reeling from a devastating military defeat and a brutal oligarchic coup, trying to purge a perceived poison from its soul. Socrates was a familiar, unsettling figure in the Athenian marketplace. For decades, he had engaged anyone who would listen in relentless questioning. He would approach a politician famed for his wisdom, and through a series of simple questions, reveal that the man knew nothing at all about justice. He would corner a general celebrated for his courage and show that he could not define what bravery truly was. His method, the Socratic method, was a philosophical scalpel, dissecting unexamined beliefs and exposing hollow authority. To his followers, he was a beacon of intellectual honesty. To his detractors, he was a subversive force, a man who taught the young to disrespect their elders and the traditions that held the city together. The recent history of Athens made his presence intolerable. Just a few years earlier, the city had lost the decades-long Peloponnesian War to Sparta. In the war's chaotic aftermath, a cruel oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants had seized power, executing hundreds and terrorizing the population. Among their ranks were several of Socrates' own former students, most notably Critias, a leader notorious for his brutality. When democracy was restored, the city was paranoid, fragile, and looking for someone to blame. Socrates, with his constant questioning of democratic principles and his association with figures like Critias, seemed to embody the cynical spirit that had nearly destroyed Athens. The trial was his stage, offered a chance to propose a lesser penalty than death. He defiantly suggested the city should reward him for his service like an Olympic hero. He refused to stop philosophizing, telling the jury that an unexamined life was not worth living. His uncompromising stance sealed his fate. The jury condemned him to die by drinking a cup of poisoned hemlock. The decision reveals a profound truth about democracy in crisis. A system built on free speech and open debate proved terrified of the one man who took those ideals to their logical extreme. The Athenians were not sentencing a man for his actions, but for the unsettling power of his questions. By silencing Socrates, they hoped to restore order and certainty. Instead, they created an eternal symbol of intellectual martyrdom. His death did not kill his ideas, it immortalized them, forcing every future generation to ask where the line is between social stability and intellectual freedom, and what price a society pays for choosing order over truth. A democracy can execute its greatest thinker, but a republic can be brought to its knees by a single, unimaginable maneuver. While Athens grappled with the ghost of Socrates, a threat was gathering in the distant mountains of Spain, a threat that would materialize in one of the most audacious military gambits in all of history. The Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca, sworn to eternal hatred of Rome, faced a seemingly impossible strategic problem. To attack Rome directly, he would have to cross the sea, but the Roman navy controlled the Mediterranean. His solution was as brilliant as it was terrifying. He would not go around the Roman strength, he would go over it. He would march his army, a force of tens of thousands of infantry, thousands of cavalry, and 37 African war elephants across the towering, frozen barrier of the Alps. This was a decision that defied all contemporary military logic. The Alps were not just a mountain range, they were a natural fortress, a domain of ice, sheer cliffs, and hostile tribes, considered utterly impassable for a large, organized army. To even attempt it was to gamble his entire force, and with it the fate of Carthage itself, on a single throw of the dice. The journey, begun in the autumn of 218 BC, was a descent into a special kind of hell. His multi-ethnic army, composed of North Africans, Iberians, and Celts, was completely unprepared for the conditions. They faced not only the brutal environment but also constant, devastating attacks from local mountain tribes who knew the terrain intimately. These warriors would roll boulders down onto the narrow paths, crushing men and animals alike, or ambush the stretched-out column from the high ground. The path was often no more than a treacherous ledge carved into the side of a cliff. The elephants, those living siege engines Hannibal counted on to shock the Roman legions, became a terrible liability. They were constantly on the brink of starvation, and their immense weight caused pathways to crumble beneath them. Ancient historians describe the horrific scene of elephants losing their footing on the icy trails and plunging thousands of feet to their deaths, taking soldiers with them. The human cost was staggering. By the time Hannibal's ragged, half-starved army finally descended into the green plains of Italy after just 15 days, he had lost as many as half of his infantry and a huge portion of his cavalry. He arrived with only a handful of his original war elephants. This was not a triumphant march, it was the arrival of a ghost army. Yet this staggering sacrifice was the prelude to a military masterpiece. The Romans, completely confident that the Alps were their ultimate shield, were caught utterly by surprise. Hannibal's sudden appearance on Italian soil was a psychological shockwave that paralyzed the Roman command. He had turned their greatest geographical advantage into their most profound strategic vulnerability. In the years that followed, he would use this hard-won position to wage a devastating campaign on Roman territory, winning a series of stunning victories, most famously at the Battle of Cannae, where he annihilated an entire Roman army. So, was the crossing an act of genius or a catastrophic blunder? It was both. The decision showcased a level of strategic vision and daring that few commanders have ever possessed. It placed him at the heart of his enemy's power for over a decade, but the price was his army's ultimate strength. He could win battles, but he could never truly replace the men and animals he lost in those frozen mountains. That initial, brutal cost may have ultimately robbed him of the final, decisive victory he so desperately sought. Rome had faced the Alps and survived, but its next great enemy was an illusion conjured by an emperor's madness. After the calculated gambles of Caesar and the strategic genius of Hannibal, we encounter a ruler whose decisions seem to defy all reason. Emperor Caligula, once hailed as a promising young leader, descended into a spiral of paranoia and megalomania that culminated in one of history's most baffling military campaigns. He declared war on the sea itself. The target was Neptune, the god of the oceans. The story goes that Caligula, planning an invasion of Britain, marched his legions to the coast of Gaul and ordered them to form a battle line on the beach. He then commanded his soldiers to attack the waves, wading into the water to stab at the surf with their swords and spears, and to fire their arrows into the endless horizon. After this mock battle, he had his men gather seashells as the spoils of war, the plunder of the ocean. He called these shells the tribute of the conquered sea. Was this the act of a man who had completely lost his grip on reality? Perhaps not entirely. Beneath the absurd theater lay a cynical and cruel logic. The Roman military treasury was famously depleted, and a campaign against Britain required a vast, expensive fleet. By declaring victory over Neptune, Caligula could claim the ocean was now pacified, a safe conduit for Roman power. More practically, the bizarre spectacle served as a justification for his next move. He levied heavy taxes and demanded bonuses from his soldiers for their great victory, and then fined them for their lack of enthusiasm in collecting the seashells. It was an elaborate public shaming of the military and a scheme to replenish his coffers, all disguised as divine conquest. This was more than a simple tax scam, however. It was a terrifying demonstration of his absolute power. Caligula was sending a message that his will was so supreme it could command nature itself, and that even the gods were subject to his authority. He was not just an emperor, he was a living god, and the entire world, including the sea, was his to command or punish on a whim. The immediate consequence was a further erosion of his support, not just among the people, but within the very ranks of his own Praetorian Guard, who had been humiliated on that beach. The long-term impact was to cement his legacy not as a conqueror of nations, but as the archetype of the insane tyrant, a man so detached from reality that he waged war on the elements. His campaign against Neptune was the ultimate expression of a power so absolute it had become utterly meaningless, a warning that when a leader's ego expands to fill the entire world, reality itself becomes the final enemy. In the desert sands of Egypt, a pharaoh decided to unmake the world. Pharaoh Akhenaten did not wage war on a foreign enemy or a body of water, but on the entire spiritual foundation of his own civilization. For nearly 2,000 years, Egyptian society had been built upon a complex and comforting relationship with a pantheon of gods, from Osiris, lord of the underworld, to Isis, the nurturing mother. The priesthood of Ammon had grown into a state within a state, wielding immense political and economic power. Akhenaten's response to this entrenched system was not reform, but revolution. He declared that all other gods were false. In their place, he elevated a single, remote deity, the Aten, represented simply as the sun disk with rays ending in hands. This was not just a new god, it was a new kind of god, one that offered blessings but demanded worship without the familiar intermediaries of myth and ritual. He uprooted the entire government, abandoning the ancient capital of Thebes to build a brand new holy city, Akhetaten, meaning the horizon of the Aten in the middle of the desert. This was a stunning act of isolation, cutting off the political and priestly classes from their traditional centers of power. Imagine the disorientation for the average Egyptian. The local temples they visited for blessings, the household gods they prayed to for protection, the entire festival calendar that marked the rhythm of life, all of it was suddenly declared illegitimate. The familiar statues of gods were chiseled away. The name of the powerful god Ammon was systematically erased from monuments. The pharaoh, who was once the bridge between the people and the gods, now positioned himself as the sole conduit to the divine, a distant figure who only he and his family could truly comprehend. This radical monotheism was a theological earthquake. For a brief time, art and culture flourished in a new, strangely naturalistic style, depicting the royal family in intimate, almost awkward poses under the rays of the Aten. But this cultural blossoming came at a terrible cost. The economy, so tied to the temple complexes, faltered. Foreign policy was neglected as the pharaoh turned his gaze inward. The people were left spiritually adrift, their ancient comforts torn away and replaced with an abstract, inaccessible deity. When Akhenaten died, his revolution died with him. His name was struck from the official king lists, his holy city was abandoned to the sand, and his successors, the boy King Tutankhamun foremost among them, worked feverishly to restore the old order. The traditional gods were welcomed back, the priesthood of Ammon was reinstated with even greater authority, and every effort was made to erase the Ammona period from history. The violent reversal was complete. Akhenaten's decision stands as a haunting paradox, a visionary push toward a single god that shattered the unity of his kingdom. He sought to channel all divine power through his own office, only to discover that a pharaoh could command the sun to rise, but he could not force it to shine in the hearts of his people. Wealth can be a fortress, or it can be the very thing that lures a conqueror to your gates. King Croesus of Lydia ruled what was perhaps the richest kingdom in the ancient world, his name itself a byword for unimaginable fortune. His realm was a nexus of trade, and he was the first to mint coins of pure gold and silver, turning his capital Sardis into a glittering monument to prosperity. Yet this very wealth made him a target for the rising power to his east, the Persian Empire under its brilliant and ambitious king, Cyrus the Great. Faced with this growing threat, Croesus did what any prudent leader would do. He sought divine guidance. He sent messengers to the most famous oracle in the known world, the Oracle of Delphi in Greece, bearing lavish gifts of gold. The question was simple: should he march against the Persians? The oracle's reply was, as always, cryptic. It declared that if Croesus attacked the Persians, he would destroy a great empire. The king, hearing exactly what he wanted to hear, took this as a clear prophecy of his own victory. He mobilized his formidable army and crossed the river Halys into Persian territory, confident that the gods were on his side. The great empire destined to fall, he assumed, was that of Cyrus. The resulting battle was a bloody, indecisive stalemate. Croesus, believing he needed a stronger force for the next campaigning season, disbanded his army for the winter, expecting no ancient ruler would fight in the cold months. It was a catastrophic miscalculation of his opponent's boldness. Cyrus did not play by the old rules. He marched his army deep into Lydia and appeared unexpectedly at the gates of Sardis. The Lydian cavalry, famed for their skill on horseback, were swiftly defeated when Cyrus used a clever tactic, placing his baggage camels in the front line. The strange sight and smell of the camels spooked the Lydian horses, throwing their charge into disarray. The Persians stormed the city. As the final stronghold fell, the prophecy was fulfilled in the most brutal way imaginable. Croesus did destroy a great empire. It was his own. The once mighty king was captured, and according to some accounts, Cyrus ordered him to be burned alive on a pyre. In his final moments, staring into the flames, Croesus is said to have cried out the name of the sage Solon, who had once warned him that no man could be called happy until his life was over. The story goes that Cyrus, moved by this display of tragic wisdom, ordered the fire extinguished and spared Croesus, keeping him as an advisor. But the kingdom of Lydia was gone forever, its legendary wealth now funding the expansion of the Persian Empire. The decision to trust an ambiguous oracle without question serves as an eternal lesson in the dangers of confirmation bias. Croesus heard not the words of the god, but the echo of his own ambition, a warning that the most expensive advice is worthless if you only listen for what you want to hear. The ruins of Sardis were still smoldering when, 6 centuries later, another king would misinterpret a prophecy with even bloodier consequences. But in the misty, unconquered lands of Britannia, a different kind of leader was about to make a choice born not of greed, but of a profound personal violation. Queen Boudica of the Iceni tribe had initially tried to coexist with Rome. Her husband, King Prasutagus, had even named the Roman emperor as a co-heir in his will, a calculated move to secure his family's position and his kingdom's autonomy. It was a decision rooted in pragmatism, a hope that appeasement would buy survival. The Roman response was a lesson in pure, brutal realpolitik. They ignored the will entirely. To them, a client king's death was an opportunity for direct annexation. Roman officials descended on the Iceni like vultures. They confiscated the royal family's lands and property, flogged Boudica publicly to humiliate her, and then committed an atrocity meant to extinguish her line and her spirit. They raped her 2 young daughters. This was more than a political annexation. It was a deliberate, savage act designed to break a people by shattering their queen. In that moment, Boudica's choice transformed from a matter of statecraft to one of primal necessity. Appeasement had failed catastrophically. The only path left was all-out revolt. She rallied not just her own Iceni warriors, but also the neighboring Trinovantes, who were seething under the weight of Roman taxes and the arrogance of the veterans who had stolen their land. Her decision was a desperate gamble for freedom, a declaration that a brutal death in battle was preferable to a life of subjugation. The initial success of her uprising was breathtaking. Her vast army, fueled by a righteous fury, swept south. Their first target was Camulogenum, a colonia for retired Roman soldiers. The city was a symbol of everything they hated, a permanent settlement of their oppressors built on land stolen from the Britons. The Romans, complacent and unprepared, were overwhelmed. The city was razed to the ground, its inhabitants slaughtered without mercy. The 9th Legion, marching to relieve the city, was ambushed and annihilated, its infantry wiped out. The rebellion was a wildfire. Next fell Londinium, a bustling commercial hub, and then Verulamium. Both were burned to ashes. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing decades later, chillingly reported that the Britons took no prisoners, gave no quarter. They hanged, burned, and crucified every Roman and Roman sympathizer they could find, with a particular fury reserved for the Druid priests who they saw as collaborators. In these actions, the controversy of Boudicca's decision is laid bare. Was this a righteous war of liberation or a descent into the same savagery they were fighting against? The initial victories were intoxicating, but they sowed the seeds of her ultimate defeat. The time spent destroying these cities gave the Roman governor, Suetonius Paulinus, a seasoned and ruthless commander, the precious window he needed. He regrouped his forces, choosing a narrow, defensible battlefield where Boudicca's numerical advantage would count for little. The final confrontation was a massacre, but this time the roles were reversed. The disciplined Roman legions, fighting in a tight formation, cut the disorganized British horde to pieces. Tacitus writes that the Romans did not even have to pursue the fleeing Britons, as their own wagons, filled with their families who had come to watch the expected victory, blocked their escape. The end was total. Boudicca, according to tradition, took poison to avoid capture. The Romans then embarked on a systematic campaign of retribution, ravaging the lands of the rebellious tribes with such ferocity that a famine is reported to have swept the region. Boudicca's revolt was a spectacular, fiery flash that illuminated the brutal reality of imperial conquest. Her decision to fight was born of an unforgivable injustice, and her initial success proved the Roman occupiers were not invincible. Yet her ultimate failure and the horrific punishment inflicted upon her people raise a haunting question when faced with annihilation. Is a glorious, self-destructive defiance the only answer left? Philosophy itself was now on trial. While Boudicca's rebellion left Britannia in ashes, a very different kind of suppression was unfolding in the heart of the Greek world. In the year 529 AD, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I issued an edict that severed a direct line to the past. He ordered the permanent closure of the Platonic Academy in Athens, an institution that had operated for nearly 900 continuous years. This was not merely the shuttering of a school, it was the silencing of a tradition. Founded by Plato himself around 387 BC, the Academy was the intellectual heir to Socrates, the place where Aristotle had studied, and the enduring symbol of rational, pagan inquiry. Its closure was a calculated blow in Justinian's grand project to unify his vast empire under a single, unshakable Christian faith. He saw the Academy and other pagan philosophical schools not as centers of learning, but as bastions of heresy and dissent, potential seeds of rebellion that threatened the theological and political unity he was trying to forge. The decision was part of a broader campaign to suppress non-Christian thought, but the Academy was the crown jewel, its end a powerful statement that the age of open philosophical debate was over. Imagine the final days within those hallowed colonnades. The last scholars, likely a small group of Neoplatonists, were forced to abandon their lectures on mathematics, metaphysics, and logic. The dialogues of Plato, once the foundation of Western thought, were now deemed dangerous. Some accounts suggest a handful of these philosophers, refusing to convert, sought exile in the court of the Persian king, taking their knowledge with them and symbolically scattering the seeds of Greek wisdom to the east. The immediate effect was the consolidation of a state-enforced intellectual conformity. By removing the most prestigious platform for pagan philosophy, Justinian effectively made Christian doctrine the only permissible framework for higher learning within his realm. The long-term consequences, however, are deeply controversial. On one hand, this act is often painted as the moment the light of classical reason was extinguished, plunging Europe into the Dark Ages. It certainly marked a decisive end to the kind of unfettered philosophical inquiry that had characterized the ancient world. Yet this view can be too simplistic. The closure did not eradicate classical knowledge. Much of it was preserved and meticulously copied by Byzantine and later Islamic scholars, who would eventually reintroduce Aristotle and others to a reawakening Europe centuries later. Justinian's decision was less about destroying knowledge and more about controlling it, about channeling all intellectual energy into the service of a unified Christian empire. He sought to build a heavenly kingdom on earth, but to do so, he felt he had to close one of its most famous schools. Spartan society was a machine designed for one purpose: to produce the most formidable soldiers the world had ever seen. At the heart of this machine was a chilling, state-mandated decision that began at the very moment of birth. According to the laws attributed to the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus, every newborn was brought before a council of elders for inspection. This was not a celebration of new life, but a cold, clinical assessment. The elders were not looking for signs of health, but for signs of weakness. Any infant deemed too small, malformed, or simply not robust enough was condemned. The official verdict was exposure. The baby would be taken to a chasm on Mount Taygetus, known as the apathy, and left to die from the elements or from thirst and starvation. This was not an act of random cruelty. It was a calculated, systematic policy of eugenics, a brutal attempt to weed out any physical imperfection from the Spartan gene pool before it could weaken the military machine. The logic was as stark as the society itself. In a world where every male citizen was a full-time soldier, there was no room for anyone who could not endure the grueling training of the agoge, the brutal military school that began at age 7. A single weak link could mean the death of his entire phalanx in battle. The decision to expose a child was therefore framed not as a personal tragedy, but as a civic duty, a necessary sacrifice for the strength and purity of the state. Imagine the weight of that choice for the parents. To defy the elders was unthinkable, a betrayal of the very Spartan ideals they lived by. Their loyalty was to the state first, their family a distant second. Yet the human cost was immense, a hidden river of private grief flowing beneath the facade of Spartan discipline. This practice raises one of the most disturbing questions in all of ancient history. Can a society's strength ever justify the deliberate killing of its own children? The Spartans believed so, and their military prowess was legendary. But this single, brutal decision at the beginning of life created a culture so single-minded, so devoid of softer virtues, that it ultimately contained the seeds of its own extinction. A state that cannot value the vulnerable may win many battles, but it has already lost its soul. A king's pride can be measured by the bridges he builds or the scars he leaves upon the earth. Xerxes I, the mighty king of kings of the Persian Empire, inherited a war with Greece from his father, Darius. But where Darius had been checked, Xerxes would not be. His plan was not a mere raid, it was an overwhelming flood of men and material, a display of power so vast it would crush the Greek spirit before a single spear was thrown. The greatest obstacle was not a Greek army, but a simple strip of water, the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe. To ferry his massive army across on ships would be slow, vulnerable, and beneath the dignity of a god-king. So Xerxes made a decision that would become a legend of both engineering and arrogance. He commanded his engineers to bind the continents together. They were to build a floating pontoon bridge across the Hellespont itself. The scale was staggering. Hundreds of ships were anchored side by side across the mile-wide strait, their decks linked by massive ropes of papyrus and flax, with a roadway of planks laid on top, complete with fences to keep the animals from spooking. It was a masterpiece of ancient logistics, a testament to the limitless resources of Persia. Then nature intervened. A violent storm blew in, smashing the carefully constructed bridge to splinters. For Xerxes, this was not a meteorological event. It was a personal insult from the sea, a defiance of his royal will. His response was as shocking as the storm itself. He did not simply order his men to rebuild. He ordered them to punish the water. He commanded that the Hellespont itself be given 300 lashes, that a pair of fetters be thrown into the sea to chain it, and that the overseers of the first bridge have their heads cut off. The water was whipped. This was more than the rage of a petulant monarch. It was a calculated performance of absolute power. Xerxes was demonstrating that even the forces of nature were subject to his command, that the very sea could be tortured, and branded a rebellious slave for daring to obstruct his divine purpose. The message to his army and to the waiting Greeks was clear. Nothing, not even the ocean, could stand against him. The bridge was rebuilt, sturdier this time, and his army of hundreds of thousands, a force so large it drank rivers dry, marched from one continent to another. This act of crossing was the pinnacle of his hubris, the moment he physically stitched Asia to Europe under his heel. Yet this very act of supreme confidence sowed the seeds of his eventual downfall. The sheer size of his army, made possible by that bridge, became its own greatest weakness, making it slow, difficult to supply, and vulnerable to the hit-and-run tactics of the Greeks. The bridge was a monument to a man who believed he could conquer the elements, but it led him straight to the narrow pass of Thermopylae, where a few thousand Greeks would teach the world the price of overreach. Rome understood that a republic could die from paralysis as easily as from tyranny. In its most brilliant and dangerous constitutional innovation, the Senate held the power to appoint a dictator. A single man granted absolute authority for a maximum of 6 months to confront a dire emergency. This was not a coup, it was a legal surrender of liberty for the sake of survival. The ideal was embodied by Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus. In 458 BC, while plowing his small farm, he was approached by a delegation of senators. A hostile army had trapped a Roman force and the state was in peril. Leaving his humble work, Cincinnatus accepted the dictatorship, mobilized an army, defeated the enemy in a single day, and with the crisis over, immediately resigned his supreme power and returned to his plow. He became the timeless archetype of the selfless leader, a man who wielded absolute authority not for personal gain but for the public good, and gave it up the moment his duty was done. He was the Republic's perfect servant, but this same mechanism, designed to save the state, contained a fatal flaw. The office of dictator was a loaded weapon left on the table, waiting for someone less virtuous to pick it up. That man was Sulla. A century after Cincinnatus, the Republic was tearing itself apart in a brutal civil war between two factions, Sulla's Optimates and Marius's Populares. When Sulla marched his legions on Rome itself to claim command, he shattered the oldest taboo. He had shown that a general could use his army to dictate terms to the state. After securing his position and fighting a war in the east, he returned to find his enemies back in control. This time, he did not just march on Rome, he conquered it. Then he had the Senate, operating under the shadow of his soldiers, appoint him not to a 6-month dictatorship, but to an indefinite one, tasked with the vague and terrifying mission of reforming the Republic. Sulla's dictatorship was the dark inversion of the Cincinnatus model. He used his absolute power not to defend the Republic, but to remake it in his image and purge his enemies. He posted proscription lists in the forum, naming thousands of citizens as outlaws. Anyone on the list could be killed on sight, with their property confiscated and their sons barred from public office. It was a state-sanctioned reign of terror, with the heads of the condemned displayed on spikes. After he had systematically eliminated his opposition and rewritten the Constitution to strengthen the Senate, he did something that shocked everyone. He resigned. He simply walked away from absolute power and retired to a private villa. He believed he had fixed the Republic, but the precedent he set was catastrophic. He had proven that the dictatorship could be twisted into an instrument of personal vengeance and political dominance. He had normalized the military occupation of Rome and the use of proscriptions. The Roman people now knew that the Republic's emergency brake could also be used to run the entire vehicle off a cliff. The very tool created to prevent one man from gaining permanent power had now shown exactly how it could be done. The ghost of Cincinnatus had been banished, and the stage was now set for a man who would learn from Sulla's example but never, ever make the mistake of giving up his power. The stage was set for a final, devastating propaganda war, and Mark Antony handed his enemy the perfect weapon. In 34 BC, in the Grand Ceremonial Hall of Alexandria, he staged a spectacle that would be his political undoing, an event known as the Donations of Alexandria. Before a mesmerized crowd, he sat Cleopatra and her children on golden thrones. He then proceeded to formally redistribute the Roman East, not as a Roman general, but in the manner of a Hellenistic god-king. He declared Cleopatra the Queen of Kings and her son by Julius Caesar, Caesarion, the legitimate king of kings. To his own children with Cleopatra, he granted vast territories that were, by law, Roman provinces. Alexander Helios was given Armenia, Media, and Parthia. His twin, Cleopatra Selene, received Cyrenaica and Libya, and his youngest, Ptolemy Philadelphus, was awarded Syria and Cilicia. This was not just a gift, it was a dynastic overhaul of the map. To the senators and people of Rome, this was an act of breathtaking treason. Antony was giving away lands conquered by Roman legions, paid for with Roman blood, to a foreign queen and her half-Eastern children. Octavian, the master of public perception, seized on this with cold precision. He obtained the will that Antony had deposited with the Vestal Virgins in Rome, and in a brilliant act of political theater, read it aloud before the Senate. He claimed the document confirmed the donations and, even more damningly, stated Antony's desire to be buried not in Rome, but alongside Cleopatra in Egypt. The message was undeniable. Antony had forsaken his Roman identity. He was no longer a consul or a triumvir, but a servant of an Eastern monarch, a man so corrupted by luxury and power that he was willing to dismember the Republic to build a private empire for his mistress and their heirs. This was the final straw for many in the Roman elite. The donations provided Octavian with the casus belli he needed, transforming a personal power struggle into a patriotic war for the survival of the Roman way of life against the decadent, seductive East. Antony's grand gesture, meant to solidify his power and legacy, ultimately painted him as the villain in a story written by his enemy, a story that would end not on a golden throne, but on a battlefield and a suicide in Egypt. Fire and the sword were only the beginning of the Qin unification project. Beyond the burning of books and the burying of scholars lay an even more monumental undertaking, a decision to forge a single, unified identity from the 7 warring kingdoms by force. Qin Shi Huang decreed that all of China would now operate under one script, one currency, and one system of measurement. This was not a gentle suggestion. It was a campaign of radical standardization enforced with uncompromising brutality. The old, diverse scripts of the conquered states were abolished. Every scribe, every official, every merchant was now required to use the small seal script of Qin. Imagine a scholar from the former state of Chu, his entire life's work written in a script that was now declared illegal, facing the impossible task of relearning how to write or risking execution. The same fate befell the various forms of coinage. The knife money, spade money, and cowrie shells that had facilitated trade for centuries were melted down and replaced with a single, uniform round coin with a square hole in the center, the precursor to the Chinese cash coin that would last for 2 millennia. Even the axle lengths of carts were mandated to a specific measurement. Why such a seemingly minor detail? So that every cart would fit into the ruts worn into the roads, creating a seamless, efficient network for moving Qin armies and officials across the entire empire. This was standardization as a tool of total control, eliminating not just political opposition but cultural memory itself. The human cost of this efficiency was staggering. The immense projects required to enact these changes, from building thousands of miles of straight roads to constructing the first version of the Great Wall, consumed lives on an industrial scale. Peasants were ripped from their farms and forced into labor brigades, working under the lash until they died from exhaustion, their bodies often buried within the very structures they were building. This was authoritarianism on a scale the ancient world had rarely seen, a society remade from the top down through terror and iron will. The controversy lies in the staggering paradox of its legacy. These brutal policies created the very foundation of a continuous Chinese civilization, a cultural and administrative unity that has persisted for over 2,000 years. The Qin dynasty itself lasted only 15 years, but the systems it imposed with such violence outlived it by millennia. The decision forces us to ask a difficult question: can the benefits of profound, lasting unity ever justify the horrific means used to achieve it? The voice of a god is not always a clear one. High on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, in a chamber thick with the smell of burning laurel and volcanic vapors, the Pythia, the priestess of Apollo, would deliver her prophecies. Her words were not straightforward commands, but riddles wrapped in mystery, and the fate of nations often hinged on their interpretation. This was the power and the peril of the Delphic oracle, a place where leaders went not for answers but for puzzles they had to solve themselves. The most famous of these, the tale of King Croesus, is a masterclass in hearing only what you want to hear. He asked if he should wage war on the rising Persian Empire. The oracle replied that if he attacked, he would destroy a great empire. Flush with confidence and his legendary wealth, Croesus assumed his victory was foretold. He marched, fought to a stalemate, and was caught off guard when Cyrus the Great pursued him back to his capital. The great empire he destroyed was his own. The prophecy was perfectly accurate and perfectly disastrous, but Croesus was not alone in his fatal misreading. Years later, the Athenians, facing the imminent invasion of the vast Persian fleet of Xerxes, sought their own guidance from Delphi. The initial prophecy they received was one of pure despair. It spoke of doom, telling them to flee to the ends of the earth, for fire and the spear would destroy their city. Desperate, they begged for a second, more hopeful reading. This time, the Pythia offered a cryptic lifeline. A wooden wall alone would be uncaptured, and that Salamis, an island nearby, would bring death to women's sons. The debate in Athens was fierce. Some argued the wooden wall referred to a thorn hedge around the Acropolis, a literal fortress, but the strategic genius Themistocles interpreted it differently. He convinced the people that the wooden wall was their fleet of triremes, their wooden ships. He argued that Salamis was not where they would die, but where they would win. He reframed the entire prophecy from one of passive defense to one of aggressive naval engagement. His interpretation was a monumental gamble. He was staking the survival of Athens on his reading of a poetic riddle. The result was the Battle of Salamis, where the outnumbered Greek fleet, using the narrow straits to their advantage, annihilated the Persian navy. Themistocles was right. The wooden wall held, and the sons of the enemy perished at Salamis, just as the oracle had said. Two leaders, two prophecies, two diametrically opposed outcomes. One king lost his empire by hearing the echo of his own ambition. One general saved his city by finding a hidden path of logic and courage within the divine words. The oracle never lied, but it never made the choice for them. The real decision always remained with the mortal who held the power, a stark reminder that when we seek divine guidance, we are often just listening for the sound of our own resolve. A single emperor's vision could redirect the spiritual destiny of the Western world. While Roman emperors had long persecuted the followers of Christ, Emperor Constantine the Great made a choice that would invert this entire dynamic. On the heels of a decisive military victory, he and his co-emperor Licinius issued the Edict of Milan in 313 AD. This was not a mere order of tolerance. It was a profound and permanent shift in imperial policy, declaring that Christians, and indeed all people, were free to follow whatever religion they chose. After centuries of being fed to lions and burned as human torches, Christians could now worship openly. Their property was restored, and their faith was placed on an equal legal footing with the ancient pagan cults of Rome. The immediate effect was a collective sigh of relief across the empire, the end of a long, brutal night of state-sponsored terror. But Constantine's decision went far beyond mere legalization. He actively favored the Christian Church, granting it vast wealth and privileges, exempting its clergy from taxes, and building magnificent basilicas that physically anchored the new faith in the landscape of power. He saw in Christianity's organized, universal structure a powerful tool to help unify his fractured, sprawling empire. A single God, a single church, a single emperor. It was a compelling formula for control. Yet this imperial embrace came with a heavy price. The newfound freedom quickly morphed into official favoritism and then into outright dominance. As Christianity became the religion of the court and the elite, the ancient pagan traditions that had defined Roman life for a millennium were slowly pushed to the margins. Temples lost their funding, their festivals were suppressed, and within a few generations, the old gods were being actively persecuted by the very state that had once defended them. The decision to legalize Christianity, born from a desire for unity, ultimately set the stage for centuries of religious conflict and the systematic suppression of the classical world's spiritual diversity. Constantine had hoped to harness the church to strengthen the empire, but in the end, the church would outlive the empire, its power cemented by the very edict that had once simply asked for its right to exist. Victory at sea can sometimes be a more dangerous poison than defeat. In the year 406 BC, the Athenian fleet won a crushing and desperately needed victory against the Spartans at the Battle of Arginusi. They had saved their city from immediate collapse, and their 6 returning generals were heroes. But the celebration was cut short by a grim and furious question from the public assembly. A storm had blown up after the battle, preventing the generals from sailing back to rescue hundreds of Athenian sailors clinging to the wreckage of their sunken triremes. Every one of those men had drowned. The mood in the Phoenix, the hill where the assembly met, turned from triumph to a fever pitch of rage and grief. The families of the dead demanded justice, accusing the generals of criminal negligence. The debate was not a calm legal proceeding. It was a raw, emotional mob, whipped into a fury by clever politicians who claimed the commanders had callously left Athenian citizens to die. The generals tried to defend themselves, arguing that the sudden, violent storm made any rescue attempt impossible, that it was an act of the gods, not a failure of command. But reason was drowned out by the collective cry for a scapegoat. In a single, tumultuous vote, the assembly condemned all 6 victorious admirals to death. The procedure itself was a travesty of Athenian law. Custom demanded each general be tried separately, but the crowd, manipulated by those seeking to eliminate political rivals, insisted on a single, collective verdict. It was a rush to judgment, a decision made in the heat of passion without a fair hearing. The sentence was carried out swiftly. The men who had just secured Athens' greatest naval victory in years were executed by drinking hemlock. The city had devoured its own saviors. The regret was almost immediate. Within months, as the initial rage subsided, the Athenians realized the horrifying truth of what they had done. They had crippled their own military leadership on the eve of the war's final, decisive campaigns. The men who had orchestrated the mass execution were themselves put on trial, accused of deceiving the people. But the damage was irreversible. The loss of so much experienced command was a blow from which the Athenian navy never fully recovered. It was a self-inflicted wound that directly contributed to their final defeat by Sparta just 2 years later, an outcome that might have been different had those 6 generals lived. The trial of the generals stands as a dark monument to the dangers of direct democracy when it is ruled by emotion rather than law. A stark lesson that the will of the people, inflamed and misdirected, can be as tyrannical as any single king. A pharaoh's name carved in stone could ensure his immortality, but what if the stone already bore the name of another? Pharaoh Ramesses II ruled for 67 years, and in that time he launched a building campaign of breathtaking scale and audacity. His face and his cartouche are plastered across Egypt on 100 monuments, from the sun-baked cliffs of Abu Simbel to the sprawling Karnak temple complex. But a closer look reveals a controversial secret. Many of these grand structures were not built from scratch, they were stolen. Ramesses made a systematic decision to usurp the monuments of his predecessors, chiseling away the names of pharaohs like Seti I and Amenhotep III and replacing them with his own. It was a deliberate, state-sponsored act of historical identity theft. Imagine a team of royal artisans carefully defacing a towering obelisk, erasing the legacy of a forgotten king to make room for the glory of Ramesses. This was not mere vanity, it was a calculated political strategy. By physically overwriting the past, he presented himself as the sole, timeless source of Egypt's power and divinity. He was not just a successor in a long line of rulers, he was the culmination of all that came before, their achievements now rebranded as his own. The immediate visual impact was undeniable. Travelers and subjects saw his name everywhere, reinforcing his omnipresence and his godlike status. Yet this glorification came at a staggering cost. The resources poured into this endless construction were immense. Quarrying, transporting, and carving millions of tons of stone required a vast army of laborers, all of whom had to be fed, housed, and managed. The financial drain on the royal treasury must have been enormous, diverting wealth that could have been used for trade, infrastructure, or securing the empire's volatile borders. The controversy lies in this trade-off. Was Ramesses a visionary leader creating a unified national identity, or a narcissistic ruler bankrupting his kingdom for a posthumous reputation? He secured his place in history as Ramesses the Great, but he did so by ensuring that the shadows of other pharaohs grew shorter with each monument he reclaimed. His decision forces us to wonder whether the greatest monuments are built to honor a civilization or to bury it. Some rulers try to conquer land while others attempt to conquer faith itself. In the turbulent 2nd century before the Common Era, the Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes turned his attention to the stubbornly independent Jewish people in his empire. He was a Hellenistic monarch, a successor to Alexander the Great's fractured legacy, and he believed that cultural unity was the key to political stability. His solution was not just political subjugation, but a systematic campaign of religious annihilation. He issued a series of decrees that outlawed the core practices of Judaism. The Torah scrolls were torn apart and burned. The observance of the Sabbath and the practice of circumcision became capital crimes. The goal was to force the Jewish population to abandon their God and adopt Greek customs, to sacrifice to the pagan gods and eat pork as a public sign of their assimilation. The most profound desecration, however, occurred within the very heart of Jewish worship. In the temple in Jerusalem, Antiochus ordered an altar to the Greek god Zeus erected right over the altar of the God of Israel. He then commanded that pigs, animals considered ritually unclean, be sacrificed upon it. This act, known as the Abomination of Desolation, was a calculated, symbolic rape of the sacred space, designed to prove that the God of the Jews was powerless against the might of the Seleucid Empire. It was a decision born of a brutal political philosophy that the spirit of a people could be broken by defiling what they held most holy. The immediate reaction was not the submission Antiochus expected, but a spark that ignited a firestorm. In the small village of Modian, a priest named Mattathias refused to offer a pagan sacrifice. When a fellow Jew stepped forward to comply, Mattathias killed both the apostate and the royal official, then tore down the pagan altar. He and his 5 sons fled to the hills, launching a guerrilla war. This was the beginning of the Maccabean revolt, led by his son Judah, who would become known as Judah the Maccabee, the Hammer. The conflict was as much a civil war as a rebellion, pitting traditionalist Jews against those who had embraced Hellenization. Antiochus had gambled that his show of force would extinguish a faith, but instead he forged a nation of warriors. The rebellion succeeded against overwhelming odds, leading to the recapture and purification of the temple, an event commemorated to this day in the festival of Hanukkah. Antiochus's decision stands as a stark lesson in the limits of power. He could desecrate a building and outlaw a scripture, but he could not legislate the human soul. His attempt to crush a religion only made it stronger, proving that faith, when pushed to the brink, can become an unbreakable weapon. The Eternal City had not been breached by a foreign enemy in 800 years. Its walls were considered as permanent as the stars, a psychological fortress more than a physical one. Yet in the year 410, the Visigothic king Alaric stood before its gates, holding the power to shatter that myth forever. His decision to break a treaty and sack Rome was not born of simple barbarian rage, but from a long, calculated series of betrayals and desperate negotiations. Alaric was not an outsider trying to break in. He was a former Roman ally trying to secure a place for his people within the empire's collapsing framework. He had served in the Roman military, and his Goths were largely Christian. For years, he had tried to negotiate a formal settlement, a grant of land, and a title for his warriors within the imperial system. But the Roman court in Ravenna, riddled with factional politics, repeatedly double-crossed him. Promises of gold and land were made and then withdrawn. Ambushes were laid for him during peace talks. He was treated not as a king to be respected, but as a nuisance to be managed and betrayed. His march on Rome was his ultimate bargaining chip, a way to threaten the empire's heart to get what his people needed to survive. He besieged the city not to destroy it, but to force the hand of the distant Emperor Honorius. The first time he surrounded Rome, he was paid a massive ransom of gold, silver, and silk to go away. The second time, he elevated a rival emperor to challenge Honorius, a political maneuver that also failed. With every diplomatic door slammed in his face, his options narrowed. The final, fateful decision to sack the city came only after all other avenues were exhausted. The gates were opened to him, legend says, by slaves who saw no reason to defend a city that had abandoned them. For 3 days, the Goths poured into Rome. The shockwaves that rippled across the ancient world were profound. The city that had conquered the known world had been violated. In far-off Bethlehem, the theologian Saint Jerome wrote that the very light of the world was extinguished. The event was so psychologically devastating that many Romans believed their own ancient gods had abandoned them, a crisis of faith that actually helped the spread of Christianity, which offered a new, otherworldly hope. Yet the sack itself was surprisingly restrained by the standards of the ancient world. Alaric, a Christian himself, had ordered that certain places of Christian sanctuary, like the churches of St. Peter and St. Paul, be respected. There was widespread destruction and looting, but the goal was plunder, not massacre. The Goths were not trying to erase Roman civilization. They were trying to extract the wealth and recognition that the empire had refused to give them peacefully. Alaric's decision revealed a brutal truth. The empire's real weakness was not its military, but its political corruption and its inability to integrate the very people it needed for its own defense. He did not break Rome because it was strong. He broke it because it was already hollow, a magnificent shell that crumbled at the first serious push from a man it had pushed too far. Blood is thicker than water, but the Ptolemaic pharaohs took this to a terrifying extreme. To preserve their dynasty's divine status and prevent their vast wealth from falling into the hands of outsiders, they adhered to a tradition of royal incest where brother married sister generation after generation. This was not a rare occurrence, but a systematic policy designed to concentrate power within a single, self-contained family, creating a closed loop of divine royalty. The most famous of these unions was between Cleopatra VII and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, a marriage of political convenience that quickly devolved into a brutal civil war. But the practice stretched back for centuries to the very founding of the dynasty by one of Alexander the Great's generals. The logic was rooted in Egyptian tradition and Hellenistic ideas of divinity. By marrying within the family, they mimicked the gods of Olympus like Zeus and Hera, and reinforced the idea that they were a separate, superior race untainted by common blood. The political benefit was immediate and powerful. It prevented rival noble families from gaining a claim to the throne through marriage, and it kept the immense resources of Egypt, the breadbasket of the ancient world, firmly under Ptolemaic control. Yet this obsession with purity came at a terrible biological cost. The gene pool, restricted for nearly 300 years, began to show devastating consequences. The later Ptolemies were often plagued with a host of physical and mental infirmities. Ptolemy VIII was famously obese and so despised by his people he was nicknamed Physcon, or the pot-belly. The lineage produced rulers prone to paranoia, instability, and a viciousness that turned the royal court into a snake pit of familial intrigue. Brothers and sisters, husbands and wives, constantly plotted against one another, their relationships poisoned by the very system meant to protect their power. The practice created a paradox of self-destruction. In seeking to create a pure, godlike line, they weakened it from within, producing rulers whose physical and mental decline made them less capable of governing the kingdom they were so desperate to keep in the family. The Ptolemies built a fortress of blood, only to discover that the walls were slowly closing in on them, generation by generation. The Ptolemies sought to control their destiny through blood, but the next ruler tried to command the very heavens. In the heart of Rome, a teenage emperor decided the city's ancient gods were no longer enough. Elagabalus, barely 14 when he seized power, was not Roman in his soul. He was a Syrian priest of the sun god Elagabal, a deity worshipped in the form of a black, conical meteorite. He brought this stone to Rome and installed it in a lavish new temple on the Palatine Hill, a temple meant to surpass the one dedicated to Jupiter himself. His decision was a theological revolution. He declared that his sun god was the one true, supreme deity, and that all the traditional gods of Rome, from Jupiter to Mars, were merely his servants. This was not an attempt to add a new god to the Roman pantheon. It was an order to demote and replace it entirely. Imagine the outrage of the Roman elite. The Praetorian Guard, the Senate, the common people, all saw their centuries-old traditions, the very foundation of the state's divine favor, being cast aside by a boy obsessed with a foreign rock. He forced senators to watch as he danced around the altar in ornate, effeminate Eastern robes, his face painted, performing ecstatic rituals that seemed bizarre and unmanly to Roman sensibilities. He went further, attempting to merge all religions by marrying the statue of his sun god to the sacred image of the Vestal Virgin, a union that was both theologically absurd and a profound sacrilege in the eyes of traditional Romans. The alienation was swift and total. His behavior, seen as both decadent and dangerously un-Roman, eroded his support with the very forces that had placed him on the throne. The Praetorian Guard, the ultimate arbiters of power, grew to despise him. The Senate saw him as an insult to the empire's dignity. His religious fervor, combined with his personal scandals and his promotion of his low-born charioteer lover to positions of high authority, made his reign untenable. After just 4 years of this escalating chaos, the decision was made. The Praetorian Guard mutinied, storming the palace. They dragged the 18-year-old emperor and his mother from a latrine where they were hiding, murdered them, mutilated their bodies, and dragged them through the streets of Rome before throwing them into the Tiber River. His religious reformation died with him. The Black Stone was sent back to Syria, and the traditional Roman cults were hastily restored. Elagabalus had learned a brutal lesson about the limits of imperial power. An emperor could command legions and levy taxes, but he could not force a civilization to abandon the gods it believed had made it great. A god could be dethroned and a meteorite sent back to Syria, but how do you silence 100 different voices all claiming to speak for the divine? In the late 4th century, the Christian world was a cacophony of scripture. Dozens of gospels circulated, from the Gospel of Thomas, filled with the secret sayings of Jesus, to the Gospel of Peter, which described a walking, talking cross emerging from the tomb. There were letters, acts, and apocalypses, each with its own passionate followers and its own version of the truth. This was the chaotic landscape facing a group of bishops who gathered in the North African city of Carthage in 397 AD. Their task was monumental: to decide once and for all which books belonged in the New Testament and which would be cast out. This was not a simple matter of collecting holy texts. It was a fierce, political, and deeply human process of canonization, a decision that would define orthodoxy and heresy for the next 1600 years. The criteria they used were as practical as they were spiritual. A book had to be of apostolic origin, believed to be written by an apostle or a close associate. It had to conform to the rule of faith, the core teachings already accepted by the major churches, and it had to have widespread, continuous usage across the Christian world. Under this scrutiny, many beloved texts failed. The Shepherd of Hermas, a popular work of visions and moral instruction, was rejected for being too recent. The fierce Gospel of Peter was condemned for its strange, docetic view that Jesus only seemed to be human. The powerful Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which portrayed her as a favored disciple, was sidelined, its voice marginalized. The controversy was not just about theology, but about power. By creating an official list, these bishops were centralizing authority. They were drawing a line in the sand, declaring that certain interpretations were in and others were out, often those that offered more mystical or egalitarian visions of the faith. The decision at Carthage did not invent the New Testament, but it gave it a definitive, closed form. The immediate effect was a slow but steady homogenization of Christian belief. The vibrant diversity of the early church was pruned back, its many branches declared dead wood. The long-term consequence was the creation of a single, authoritative text that could be translated, taught, and used as a foundation for both profound piety and brutal persecution. The bishops at Carthage sought to end the chaos, but in doing so, they made a choice that still echoes in every sermon, every creed, and every debate about what it truly means to be a Christian. They decided which voices would be heard for millennia and which would be whispers in the desert. 25 ancient choices have shown us the terrifying weight of a crown. From the burning of books to the crossing of a river, from a war on the sea to the silencing of a philosopher, these were not simple mistakes but monumental gambles made by individuals who held the fate of millions in their hands. Each decision, whether born of cold strategy, divine madness, or desperate survival, reveals the same fundamental truth: absolute power exists on a razor's edge, a fine line where visionary genius bleeds into catastrophic folly, where the quest for unity can shatter a culture, and the drive for immortality can erase a civilization's memory. The echoes of these choices are still with us in our laws, our faiths, and our deepest questions about authority and obedience. The map of our world was drawn by their hands, for better and for infinitely worse. So we turn the question to you. After this journey through the ambitions and terrors of the ancient world, which of these controversial decisions do you believe was the most consequential? Which leader's choice, in your view, truly changed everything? Share your thoughts below.